Welcome everyone to Bobcast. We're just going to get started in just a minute or two, so thank you for your patience. Hi there, welcome everybody. My name is Jessica Bynoe, and I am a proud double violet presenting to you today on leadership development and succession planning for NYU clubs, groups, and boards. As I said, proud double violet, graduated from the College of Arts and Science as well as Wagner, and I'm currently serving as the Vice President of the NYU Alumni Association. I'm really excited to be hosting this third session of Bobcast, and today we're going to cover a lot of information about how you all as club leaders, board leaders, affinity group members can really start to think about how to develop leadership on your groups, on your clubs, and think about what happens when we prepare for those moments of transition in leadership and the best practices that we could lean on from across the NYU community to make your club that much stronger and to sustain the NYU community that you're building. So I'm going to go ahead and put up our PowerPoint. All of this will be available for you all to refer back to. So don't take anything like that. We'll have everything available for you online. And leadership development and strategy. I am serving currently as Vice President of NYUAA. I've served for 3 years as President of the College of Arts and Science Alumni Association. I've been a mentor for students in the Leadership Initiative, and through many different committees at NYU, I've really helped to support the growth and sustainability of the alumni community. So I really look forward to sharing some of those best practices with you today.
For 1 second, because I think we're having a quick sound issue.
We're having a sound issue, I'm being told.
That's great.
That we're just going to address. We have the audio on.
Now this one.
All right.
You're able to hear it, Casey?
Yeah. I think we're. Nope, we stopped sharing PowerPoint for a moment. Put the share screen again. Okay. And Yeah, all right. Just let us know if everything is working through the chat function. We have some really fabulous alumni relations staff here that are helping us out. Casey and Jenny are right beside me, so they're monitoring anything if we run into any more problems. So hopefully you all have heard much of the introduction that I gave, but it was really just to instill confidence that I know what I'm talking about today. So hopefully we've gotten that. Today we have 3 goals of this session. We're going to talk about what leadership development is and how it relates to succession planning in the context of NYU alumni volunteerism. This is a really big concept. Leadership development is an entire field in and of itself, and we as volunteers can only do so much, but I'm hoping to break it down into some core strategies that you can use every day as part of your alumni leadership and volunteerism. We'll talk about the underlying values that support that work. This is really critical to making sure that we do this work authentically and that it's not just going through the motions of saying we're going to achieve certain goals when we really don't feel them. So we'll talk about what that means at the individual level, the group level, and the organizational level. And finally, I'm going to share with you a couple of concrete best practices for NYU groups and clubs to nurture and grow their leaders and to really sustain that community that you're building, to work through leadership transitions, and hopefully you'll be able to leave with some concrete takeaways to start employing right away. We're going to have some time for questions and comments at the end. Please use the chat function throughout the talk in order to put your questions in there, as well as share any best practices that you have in your own experiences. We want this to be a dynamic group for everybody to learn from each other. All right. So let's start with this idea of what do we mean when we really say leadership development. Like I said, it's a huge idea, and essentially in the context of NYU alumni groups, what we're talking about is creating the environments, the space, and the culture for members of a group, regardless of where they sit in the structure of the group, to lead and contribute and shape the group's goals and direction. So this requires the current leadership of the group to do a few things. First, it's really critical to have a clear understanding of the members of your group's interests and gifts. This takes time. I mean, that really is the essential ingredient here. It takes time for you to talk with and meet with the members of your group to understand what talents, what gifts, what things they really want to work on. And I really challenge leaders of clubs and boards not to put their volunteers in a box. Just because somebody might be a marketing executive, it might not be the skills they want to contribute to a leadership experience in a volunteer capacity. They might be really interested in event planning, or maybe they have a love of bylaws that they want to work on. Really talk to people to get to know what they might want to work on. And when you do this, you can really unleash those talents and invite people in. That really breeds a culture of accessibility and openness. And you really have to make sure that you're engaging beyond the inner circle of your club or your group. So let's make sure you're not keeping this only within the officers of your group or only within the people you started a regional club with. You really want to expand that, and that will inherently breed transparency and accessibility, which actually prepares you for succession planning. Once you get to know the group and invite them in and really make sure that you're listening to everybody, that's what can prepare you as a leader to think down the line to who's next, what's going to happen next, who's going to take the reins in the future. So succession planning, I think we all know why it's important. No group is ever served by a single leader or a small group. We all know that we need fresh ideas and processes and new ways to build community. I don't think I'm selling anybody on the idea of succession planning. But the real key is not the succession part, but it's the planning part. You really need to prepare and plan for leadership transitions. Whether it's the chair or the president of a group, or committee chairs that are really supporting the various projects that a club or a board or alumni group is doing, you really need to know what's coming down the pipe, who the next leader will be a year out or even more. This way, the current leaders can work with the next group to ensure there's no loss of momentum, there's a transfer of institutional knowledge and relationships, and really things can happen in a really seamless way. What's critical here is that the planning itself has to be clear and transparent and objective. Everybody on the board or part of the group needs to know what the process is for new leaders to be appointed or elected or voting on. You know, they might happen in lots of different ways. Some groups have nominating committees, others have votes, others might work with their staff partners to really figure out those transitions. Any of them are fine as long as they're objective, clear, and transparent. That will really decrease any infighting. It'll avoid confusion or disappointment, and really make sure that no one is thinking that the system is rigged for personal favor or anything like that. The clearer we are, the better it is for everybody. And the further ahead out you are in your succession planning, the more you can aid in avoiding any of that confusion. Some of the best nonprofit boards that I've seen in action actually have chair-elect positions. So those positions are often appointed 6 months or a year ahead of the transition moment happening formally. But this way, everybody knows what's next and who's next and how things are going to roll out. So these two things, leadership development and succession planning, are intimately related. If you are doing leadership development in an ongoing way, equitably across your board, across your group, succession planning is a piece of cake. You know where your talents lie, you know who's interested. People have been able to test their leadership in low and increasingly high-risk situations. So there's real clarity in knowing who's next and what's going to happen. I kind of like to think about it as a metaphor of an airport, right? I know it's going to sound weird, but in an airport, you have all these planes lined up for takeoff, especially if you're in a major metropolitan area like New York City. So all the planes are taxiing and on the runway, and there is absolute clarity of which planes are going to take off next. And there are planes that are taxiing, and there are planes that are boarding, and they're all at different parts of the process. They're all moving along a process that's very clear. And air traffic control is in everybody's ear, making sure that everybody knows how the decisions are being made absolutely objectively. So when that next plane takes off, it's no surprise. No one's jockeying, no planes are crashing into each other. It's a nice, smooth transition. Everybody knows what to expect, and lo and behold, at some point, every one of those planes get up in the air to prove themselves and demonstrate their worth and value. So it's the same idea that we're trying here. Now, there's still an art to it, and we're going to get to that in the value section. But we need that process and that objectivity to support the art that we're trying to build in leadership development. So let's move on to what supports all of this work. The first thing I want to talk about is the values that we need to live by when we think about leadership development, particularly for leaders of a club or a board or a group. It's important to remember, why we're doing this and how we want to lead. If you don't start with the values, you'll literally go through the motions and they'll be hollow. And nothing can disenchant future leadership faster than hollow strategies. So we really want to identify, be honest about, and live the values that we have. Now, I won't go through all of these in huge detail, but I'll start with the personal values. These are the values that the leaders, whether they be, again, committee chairs or entire group chairs and presidents of boards and groups, need to really live and exhibit. The one I want to spend the most time on is probably the one that underpins this whole idea, and that's servant leadership. If you're not familiar with servant leadership, it's really an idea that as an individual, you've been given a charge and a responsibility, and it's not about yourself as a leader. It's about what you can do to really elevate and live the values of the institution. This is about organization first, person as a vessel to help move that organization forward. And this is critical for all the other personal values that underpin this. A servant leader will not be afraid to approach leadership development or succession planning with vulnerability and humility. We need to recognize as leaders that we don't have all the answers, and the next generation will add great value to the community that we're all trying to advance forward. But you can't approach that. You can't honestly lead as a servant leader without having that understanding for yourself, that it's not about you. I think one of the most powerful things that an individual leader can say or embody is when you're sitting in a room with lots of voices that you want to authentically engage, and the leader actually says, personally, I'm not partial to any particular way that we do something as long as we achieve the goals that we all agree on. Right? So that really takes the leader out of a personal vestment in how, right? And that creates space for others to shape and change and move the organization towards the greater goals that everybody believes in. So that servant leadership, that putting yourself in a different space and a different place can really set the tone for how you support others and how you get ready to make that next transition. Now, again, all of this takes a lot of time, which is where that generosity comes in and the candor comes in also. To be a leader in this space and to support others, you need to be generous with your time, with your information, with your ideas. You can't kind of hold your cards too close to your vest. I mean, it's, you know, there's maybe other industries and other fields where you need to lead that way. But the more open and generous a leader is with information and with themselves, the easier this process is, and the better you can really relate with and to the base of your group so that they're ready and inspired to take on the reins in the next round of leadership. So let's talk about the group. The group has to embody a couple of values as well. Most key here is probably flexibility and openness. Again, if we've done our job, everybody is prepared and understands where the next leadership is coming from and who's next. However, a new person brings new processes, new ideas, new ways of working, and a group, no matter what, no matter how prepared, will always react to change in different ways. And so I challenge everybody on this webinar and listening to think about, regardless of where you sit in your board or in your organization, how can you demonstrate flexibility and openness and support of future leaders, of emerging leaders, of people that have expressed interest in leadership? These values, when everybody employs them, really do help to embolden and enliven the organizational values that we're all stewards of. Again, we're all servant leaders. We're all stewarding a bigger organization than ourselves. It's not about whose idea is the best. It's about who's leading to make sure we're creating space so that we're exhibiting and moving towards the organizational values that we all believe in. So these organizational values that I wanted to talk about, again, these are larger than any one individual. Individuals in our space and other boards and organizations all over this world, individuals will come and go, right? That's the difference between your personal leadership and personal power and positional leadership and positional power. We are all privileged to be in these positions because we exhibited different personal leadership qualities, but ultimately we are serving a leadership position which is tied to an organization. So we are stewards of the organization's values. And the ones that I put here that we really hear a lot about in the NYU community, and I think underpins all of NYU's different clubs and boards, are transparency, equity, inclusivity, unity, and sustainability. I want to talk about equity and inclusivity first. These are major themes that are in every industry right now. As leaders and contributors to the NYU alumni community, we need to think about how do we live those values, how do we steward those values on behalf of NYU in our roles? How do we create space to make sure that everybody's voices can contribute to a process? Whether it's the leadership day-to-day of a group or organization, or leadership during a transition, or suggestions of who to lead during a transition, we really need to make sure that we're inclusive of all the voices. The newest volunteer that just showed up at the last event, all the way to the former president of the group that has a lot of that historical knowledge. How do we make sure their voices and everything in between is really included and invited to the table to think about leadership of the group? And then equity, that we all really have access and ability to engage. So you're not just, yes, we're invited, yes, we're said that we can have our voice, but how do we make sure that the real processes we're putting in place allow for equitable contribution, allow for everybody to access that. If you're a global club and you're making decisions about a geographic space that's quite large or span several time zones, how do you make sure you're all coordinating and everybody can have equitable access to engage, and therefore equitable access to become a leader for that group? These things allow for more transparency. Again, this is a theme that I've talked about a couple of times already. Transparency is key. The more that we're able to lay out the process before it happens, be clear and objective on leadership criteria, the better the feeling of the community is going to be, which will get us to unity and sustainability. The unity of the group, and therefore the sustainability of this community, which at the end of the day, everything we're talking about today is really geared towards how are we sustaining this community beyond you and I, beyond who's coming next. We're talking about an institution that's been around for over 150 years. We need to figure out how to sustain that for another 150, 250 years, and we're not going to be here to do it. So we need to make sure that we're sustaining that over time. And again, it's about processes, policies, not about individuals. So let's take the values and move them into some concrete strategies. I've divided them up into different temporal periods of when you might be doing these strategies. The first one, though, is your ongoing strategies. This is really the work that you are doing as a leader, as an emerging leader, as a good steward of the group that you're part of. If you're the leader of a club, a chair, a president, whatever your name is, the first thing you really need to think about is how are you building bench strength? Building bench strength is about lining those airplanes up. Who's next in line? How are you making sure that they're feeling supported and getting what they need to exhibit leadership, and so that they're ready to take the reins for increasing levels of leadership? I've seen this done pretty concretely twice. One I was a part of when I was the president of the College Alumni Association. I noticed that it was a trend that vice presidents, so existing officers, were always co-chairing committees. So as a result, you had people having dual leadership roles and kind of taking up space for future leaders to come on and chair committees. So when I was president, I made it a practice that vice presidents could not chair committees for the College Alumni Association, and instead we had to bring up new members to be chairs of those committees. So right off the bat, that increased the number of leadership roles by 5 or 6 people. And when you're talking about a board of 30 to 40 active members, that's a significant number of new leadership positions that you can utilize to build bench strength. Heather Kennedy did the same thing when she was president of NYUAA. She removed vice presidents from being chairs of committees as well and created a committee liaison position. This did two things. The vice presidents in their new role as committee liaisons were no longer filling those spots, but also they were able to mentor and support the next generation coming up. So you had a duality in that strategy of building and mentoring and supporting bench strength. A couple other things on the ongoing strategies. We've talked about connecting with all your volunteers, assessing their skills and interests. Demonstration projects is a great way to build bench strength, really getting people to experiment with projects and leading projects. I think the Women's Initiative is doing this quite well when members come up with new event ideas or strategies to increase the community in the Women's Initiative. The committee, the leadership committee, the chair, they let them run with it. You know, they support them, but let them run with it. And that idea that individuals can create new events in lower risk moments gives people an opportunity to test new leaders, test leadership capabilities, test what they want to do. And it gives the leaders of a club or a group an ability to see people in action and not just think hypothetically, will they make a good leader? So think about what demonstration projects you can have in an ongoing way as part of your club. And finally, celebrating success. You don't want to build up all this leadership ability and promise and hope and then not recognize it. I think that the NYU clubs in Japan and Shanghai in particular do a great job of really lifting up volunteers that have made an impact. We have the NYU Volunteer Awards that we give out each year, and every year there's a dozen recommendations from Shanghai and Japan. And I think that's wonderful because it really says we recognize you, we value you, and you're the kind of alumni leader we want to see as we move forward. So those are things, again, ongoing, happening all the time. When a leadership transition is about to happen, and again, the temporal idea of when is flexible, and we can talk a little bit more about that if there are questions related to it, but you need to start to think about who's going to be the next leader? How do we make sure that we're managing a transition well? I think that one of the best things that you could do when you're doing this is seeking counsel. You need to ask others who are part of the alumni group who they see as having the capability and the skills and the demeanor to be the next leader of a group. And again, ask in an inclusive way. Ask the past presidents, ask the brand new volunteer, and really get an understanding of what the group needs from their next leader. The other way that you can test potential new leadership is offering proxy opportunities. When you're close to a leadership transition, maybe there's 2 or 3 people that have emerged as really great candidates, offer proxy opportunities. Have them lead a meeting or have them welcome people to an event. It really starts a transition and helps for a visible leadership shift. So when the person is appointed or elected, the new chair or president, there's no surprise. That's, oh yes, I've seen that person before. You know, they've clearly been around for a while and have had a real fingerprint in this work already. It's not a grand surprise. And then finally, really using clear communication on the process and objective criteria for assessment and selection. On the College Alumni Association board, we actually have a chart that everybody is aware of about how many meetings they've attended, what kind of committee engagement they've had, how many events they've attended, and everyone literally gets a score. And while that might sound really dry and almost terrible, it gives us a grounding at least on objectively understanding how much people have been engaged. Again, there's an art to it, and we need to employ all those other values, but having that structure, at least having some data to support your decisions, can really help alleviate any of that confusion down the line if you don't have that clarity. And then finally, after a leadership transition, your job's not done as an existing leader. You really need to continue to support the group and show public support of new leadership. I think that Nick Jensen, who's the former co-chair of the LGBTQ group, has done this in a really thoughtful way. He'll say regularly, I want to make sure I attend that event so people really see me supporting the next generation of leaders and co-chairs of the group. So he's very intentional about what does it signal when a past chair or past president goes to an event to support the new one. So just keep that in mind as transitions happen. If it's a transition one and done and the leader's out of there, people start to read in between the lines, whether there are lines to read in between or not. So just be conscious of those things. And ultimately, that's the sustainability piece. We're here, we're stewards temporarily, but we're setting up that sustainability for the long run, and you need to make sure you follow through the entire process when you're doing this work. So I know I've covered a lot of information and we've touched on values and strategies and what's an art and what's a science to this. But I am happy to talk more about this and answer any questions. I hope ultimately this gave you all some insight and perspective into the tools that you could use, and look forward to hearing from you if you wanted to follow up one-on-one with any additional questions that I might be helpful with, or point you in the direction of other alumni leaders that I know are doing this work really well all over the world. So I'm going to shut off the PowerPoint. You'll see a video next, and then we'll get to any questions people might have. All right. So I see there's a little bit of some chat. Looks like first we had some audio issues, which I know we've addressed. And it looks like, all right, great. So we have a couple questions here. First question I see here is about the time that clubs should really dedicate to implementing these strategies. So I think, as I mentioned, the leadership development work is ongoing. I think if you're a good leader and a good steward of your club or your group, this isn't even an extra, right? This is part of the work that you're doing. You're doing the outreach, you're getting to know all of the volunteers that are coming out. So I don't like to think about leadership development as a start and stop kind of thing. It's ongoing. The succession planning, I think you need to start seriously thinking about succession and who's next in whatever leadership positions you're talking about a year before a transition is going to happen. I think that's a pretty standard amount of time. I know some groups are smaller, so I think relative to the size of your group, 6 months, 4 months is really starting to get close on that window, but it requires some thought. It requires, in order to do that work of seeking the counsel and talking to people, it requires, a good runway to continue the metaphor of the airplanes. I see another question here about what's one concrete thing that we could do as a club at our next meeting to begin the conversation about leadership development. That's a great question. I would start with thinking about assessment and giving people a chance to define their own hopes and goals and skills that they want to bring to the group. I think having an open discussion where everybody's able to say, hey, I've been working on this event as part of this club for years. I love being involved in this wine tasting event that we do every year, or I love being involved in organizing this panel every year, but this year I'd really like to stretch myself and be more involved in our social media or be more involved in our marketing. Unless you give space for that conversation for each individual to define what they want to contribute, you're going to miss the ball, and it's really important to facilitate that conversation. So it could be an icebreaker, it could be a 30-minute conversation, but I'd encourage you to think about that as a conversation starter, and as an individual leader, follow up with your folks and have deeper conversations about their plan and their goals. If anybody watching this manages people in your real life in your job, when you do performance reviews or you do mid-year check-ins with your employees, I bet you ask them what their long-term goals are. You should be thinking in the same way about your volunteers who are part of your club. Think about asking them, what are their aspirations in this community? What do they see themselves doing? Not everybody's going to want to run the club, but let's give them a chance to think about events they want to run or other clubs they want to be involved in or other things they want to take the leadership roles in. But you have to have those conversations. All right. Another question, how can leaders use their staff partners as a resource for succession planning? I think your staff partners are your best friends. When I was president of the College Alumni Association, Anne Marie Ledisa was my right and left hand, I think. She really helped me think through things and plan. Your staff partners have their pulse on what's moving and who's saying what and who's interested in doing things. They know if one of your club leaders is involved in another club or interested in something else or what they did when they were a student. So your staff partners are a wealth of knowledge and a huge resource. You should be meeting with them frequently, have lunch with them, pick their brain, think about what the timing is right, and think about how you can support each other. Don't put all the burden on your staff. They're doing 8 million and one things. So work together as a partnership and think about how to manage that transition together. They'll definitely have perspective and opinion, but they also respect the roles that the volunteers play and the way that we are all shaping this community. So your staff partner will really help you through this. Great. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have and all the time that we have today. Again, this whole session has been recorded, so all the resources will be available online, and I hope that you tune in and share widely with your friends and colleagues that are part of the NYU volunteer community. Thanks again for joining, and hope to see you around the square. Take care. All right.